In my first video on human research methods, I discussed the distinctions between descriptive and analytical research, and also the distinction between qualitative and quantitative, and we looked at the advantages of each method. In this video, I want to go into more depth on some of the subtypes of research, but first I want to talk about the underlying philosophies and research methods. Some people argue that quantitative methods assume a positivistic philosophy, that everything can be measured and counted. And qualitative methods are more appropriate if you've got a constructivist or interpretative philosophy. And therefore, some people argue that qualitative research is more appropriate in a theological or ministry context. But it's not as simple as that. Most quantitative researchers recognise the limitations of the numbers that they gather, and they will make allowances for those. Surveys include space for people to write in some of the nuances. Conclusions are carefully drawn, recognising the same answer can have many meanings, and one can look at some of those different meanings by comparing what the same people have said on other questions. And in qualitative research, there's often the need to count the frequency of particular ideas and to categorise meanings. Qualitative programs such as NVivo include some statistical measures. The philosophy has to do with how you use the data more than whether it's quantitative or qualitative. Can you use both? Yes, certainly. It's called triangulation when you use different sources of information and add them together, and it can give great strength to a study, enabling you to look at both the depth and the breadth of your subject matter. But it does involve mastering two major forms of analysis, and that can be very challenging. There are many other subtypes in terms of research methods, variations in the way that the studies are constructed. There's action research, in which the research becomes part of a whole program of activity, setting up an educational program, for example. There's appreciative inquiry, which notes that what you're often doing is actually trying to appreciate, trying to look at the positive aspects of a particular situation. Grounded theory is a form of descriptive research in which one tries to formulate theories, and it can be relevant where there are no theories, but that doesn't often apply in our world these days. Phenomenological research tries to get to the very essence of human experience. It's very hard to do well, and again is mostly descriptive. There are also different styles of qualitative research. Most basic is the one-off interview with an individual in which semi-structured interview questions are used. A grounded theory means that you listen but then go back to the same people with your reflections, your theorising. And narrative research is when you ask people to tell their story with few prompts. And it's certainly very relevant when you're doing historical sorts of research. There's the gathering of qualitative materials over time, such as people's journals and blogs, or interacting with people over time, including many conversations. Case studies look at a particular situation from a variety of angles. For example, you're studying youth groups, and you may study them from the leader's perspective, the parent's perspective, the perspective of the youth themselves. And so they may involve a combination of several methods: observation, interviews with leaders, surveys of youth and parents. You're building up a picture of a particular situation, and you do so from a variety of perspectives. Another major type of research method is testing and intervention. And this method is very common in health and psychological research. It can also be used in educational and other research situations where you're asking what is the impact of a particular program or activity or other intervention. And here you need a test, retest type of methodology. You test at the start and you test again at the conclusion after the intervention has occurred, after the program has been run, for example. In that sort of methodology, you normally need a control group which does not have the intervention or has a different sort of intervention, so that you can see then whether a real difference has occurred. People inevitably change over time, but has this particular intervention actually made a significant difference? Okay, what research methods should you use? Again, the fundamental question is, what do you want to know? What do you want to draw conclusions about? If you want to draw conclusions about a large population, such as Australians, then you'll need data from a large sample. You'll need a survey. If you want to draw conclusions about the development of particular concepts or understandings or practices or factors among a small group of people, interviews may be most appropriate. Beware. You can't draw conclusions about Australians, how they think, what they do, from just a few interviews. You may say, on the basis of a few case studies, that these are particular ways in which the dynamics of some groups work. Or on the basis of interviews, that these concepts are tied to these other concepts in people's thinking. When you're evaluating the research of others, always check if they have sufficient grounds for their conclusions. What research did they do? In some cases, they haven't done any. It's just their opinions about the world. But if they have done research, what was their methods? Did they take into account the diversity of people? Did they have an adequate sample to draw the conclusions they've drawn? Have they stated their sampling method? Note that American research does not provide good grounds for conclusions about Australia. What works in one context doesn't necessarily work in others. So think through your context, think through what you want to say, and then you can determine what is the best method in order to reach the conclusions that you want to draw.